In the previous lecture, we saw some early libertarian theories from Greek philosophy, and then another development hundreds of years later by medieval philosophers. The next major development in libertarianism again waits several hundred years. Things happen slowly in philosophy. The basic idea of the new development, which is known as agent causation, might have been implicit in earlier views, but in philosophy, it's important to make things as clear and explicit as possible. That you want to make things more precise, or as contemporary philosophers sometimes say, precisified. They probably shouldn't say that. But we find this kind of explicitness in Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid, who lived from 1710 to 1796. He was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. You maybe didn't know that Scotland had an Enlightenment, but in the 18th century, Scotland had a fantastic wealth of intellectual might. David Hume, who may be the greatest English-speaking philosopher in history, thrived during this time. Adam Smith, who was obviously a major figure in the development of economics and capitalist theory, and Thomas Reid is another important philosopher from this period. Reid helped to found what he called the common sense school of philosophy. In the first lecture, I maintained that philosophy typically starts with common sense, and Reid would certainly have agreed with that. Moreover, Reid thought that common sense was typically right. He tried to articulate and defend what he took to be the views of the common man. He agreed with earlier indeterminists that determinism would rule out free will and responsibility. But then he needs to ask, well, what is the freedom that is supposed to give us responsibility and oppose determinism? According to Reid, it's important to recognize that it's the person who causes the decision. The source of the indeterminist contribution is in the person. So far, that might just seem to restate the older views. After all, even Epicurus said that the choice, quote, depends on us. But what Reid is more explicit about is that the person, the agent, cannot be identified with some set of character traits or convictions or other kinds of psychological properties. Rather, according to Reid, the self is the soul. It's an immaterial substance. To communicate the significance of this, though, I need to give a bit more background on how this view fits into the time of Reid's philosophical developments. So, philosophers during Reid's time were engaged in an intense debate about the nature of the self. The debate continues to this day. Philosophers continue to try to figure out what the self is, much like the debate about free will. The basic framework for this debate was established during this period in philosophy, the 17th and 18th centuries in philosophy, which was known as the modern period. And this is perhaps the greatest period in Western philosophy in terms of fertility of ideas and theories. Some of the prominent philosophers of the time had suggested that what the self really is just the collection of all of one's thoughts and memories and feelings and aspirations. This is sometimes called the bundle view of the self, because the idea is that the self is just the bundle of psychological traits or characteristics. So the idea that the self is a bundle can be captured or seen to be somewhat intuitive if you think about what would happen if I lost all of my psychological traits. Let's say I lost all of my convictions, all of my aspirations, every bit of personal memory. I couldn't remember who my parents were. I couldn't remember who my kids were. What these philosophers say is that at that point, when I've lost all of those psychological traits, I'm dead. I'm not here anymore. I don't exist at that point. And at least in certain moods, that can seem like a pretty sensible view. If I've lost all of the stuff that I think and want and remember, then I'm not around anymore. But Reid thought that this view was completely wrong-headed. And his famous retort was, so the idea is, what the other philosophers had said, what I am is just the collection of my thoughts and feelings and actions. And Reid's retort was, quote, I am not thought, I am not action, I am not feeling, I am something that thinks and acts and suffers. So his idea is that I'm not identical to the collection of my psychological states. I'm separate from them. In fact, the right way to understand the relationship is they belong to me. My psychological traits, like my memories and my thoughts and my feelings, I own them. In that sense, they're a bit like my clothes. So whatever you hear about the clothes making the man, that isn't literally true. Changing my wardrobe would hardly be tantamount to the death of self. I wouldn't be dead if somebody came into my house and took away all my clothes and replaced them with more fashionable ones. My clothes belong to me. The same is true, Reid maintained, for particular psychological traits. Those traits are fleeting. I think one thing today, I thought a different thing yesterday, I had one feeling last year, I have a new feeling this year. They're changing all the time. And if what I was just those states, then I would be changing all the time as well. I wouldn't be the same person, and the person I was 15 years ago would be dead. So Reid says, you can change all of that stuff. You can change all those psychological traits, and that isn't tantamount to death of self any more than changing all of your clothes kills the self. Again, the main dispute here is whether the psychological traits we have constitute the self. Do the traits make the person? Reid's answer is absolutely not. The person is a thing that enjoys or suffers the various psychological activities, but the person can persist even when the psychology changes radically. In philosophy, the notion of the soul is notoriously difficult to characterize, but Reid maintains that at a minimum, the soul is the seat of our consciousness, and that it's a substance that's utterly different from the kinds of physical substances that scientists study. What I really am, what myself is this non-physical soul. And I, this soul, am the source of free choice. I am the agent that causes the choice. That's why the view is known as agent causation. The agent, it's a special kind of thing, different from all the rest of the stuff in the universe, and the agent causes the decision. And Reid says that this view of freedom is not just a philosopher's technical notion. He says we find it in the lowest of the vulgar, he says. And here again we see his commitment to common sense philosophy. He thinks that the idea of free will is universal and early emerging. He thinks that we acquire the belief so early that we have no memory for when or how we acquired it. What he says sounds a little better. He says, this conviction we have so early in life that we have no remembrance when or in what way we acquired it. I'd known about this claim of Reid's for some time, but it was really brought home to me by my own daughter several years ago. She just turned 3. She was a few days over 3. One night at the dinner table, she said, completely out of the blue, I can say a bad word. I bet I can. Now, the very worst word she knew, the one that was at the outer limit of terrible curse words, she confessed later, was shut up. Sadly, she knows worse words than that now. But this all seemed to fit with Reid's claim that we get the notion of free will very early indeed, that even a 3-year-old has the sense that I can perform this action, but I choose not to. She didn't say shut up in that particular case. So it seems like you have this really early sense of free will that the children are attuned to. And this particular episode with my daughter inspired me to go out and run some systematic experiments on whether young children have something like a notion of free will. But the details of that will have to wait until lecture 11. What we have from Reid is a sharper picture of libertarianism. Free will requires that the agent, the soul, makes the decision without being determined. In the 20th century, Charles Arthur Campbell, who lived from 1897 to 1974, provided what has come to be regarded as the classic presentation and defense of an agent causal account of free will. And this was in his book on selfhood and godhood. He was very careful to distinguish what I've been calling the descriptive question from the substantive question. He distinguishes the question, what do we think free will involves, from the question, is there any such thing that meets that condition? And he says, there are many ways that people use the term free will. And this, as we'll see in Lecture 7, becomes a major point of philosophical dispute. But Campbell says we can identify the one that really matters as for the free will debate. It's the kind of freedom that's required for moral responsibility. So that's what he wants to say. Of course, people use the word free will in lots of ways. What we want to find out is, what is the kind of freedom that you have to have in order to be morally responsible? So that will limit the question of what's the right answer to what's required for free will. We're thinking about free will in terms of its connection with moral responsibility. And Campbell pursues this project by maintaining that there are three features of the relevant notion of free will. There are three critical features. The first one is the notion of free will applies to your internal acts or choices and not to the external consequences of your act. So he says when it comes to moral responsibility, and again, that's where we're tying free will to, that's what we're tying free will to. When it comes to moral responsibility, we only care about the person's decision, not about the consequences of it. So if somebody decides to save a drowning person, but for some reason fails to reach them in time, we still count their action as morally praiseworthy. What they did is right. They're responsible for making the good moral choice because they made it freely. They were responsible for making the choice to go out and save the person. Similarly, if somebody decides to kill someone, but the bullet is deflected, we still count them as morally blameworthy for such a morally defective decision, even though the consequence was good. We focus on the internal act, not on the external consequences. The second feature that Campbell thinks characterizes our notion of free will is that an action comes from free will only if the person was his term is, the sole cause of the choice. And his point here is really central to the libertarian agenda. There are lots of influences on our decisions, our character traits. There are lots of influences like our convictions, our aspirations, our character traits. But it seems that free will requires that I myself can do something that diverges from those influences. And this echoes the inchoate point that was made by Alexander of Aphrodisias about Socrates acting against his nature. But Campbell is much more explicit, both in distinguishing descriptive from substantive claims and in clarifying the idea that the person is the sole cause, the idea that this is an important part of our notion of free will. To establish that this is in fact the way we think about free will, Campbell notes that some of the factors that influence our choices are not chosen by the person. So if you have a genetic propensity to fatigue, say, you can't be held responsible for having that propensity. You can only be held responsible for how you respond to that propensity. We have to make allowances for the factors that the self didn't choose, like genes or childhood environment. Campbell is really sensitive to this. He doesn't want to say that people can be blamed for growing up in a bad environment or for having bad genes. I can only be responsible, he says, for the part of the choice that excludes all of those external influences, the part of the choice that doesn't include the unchosen character traits. So I might get stuck with certain character traits through no fault of my own. I can't be held responsible for that. Campbell says the only thing I can be held responsible for is the choice that I make independent of all that. So he says the way we normally think about responsibility, we are willing to excuse a lot because we recognize that a lot of the factors that go into a decision are obviously outside of an agent's control. So I can't change the fact that I was born and raised in a small town in Montana. Not that I would want to change that, but it wasn't under my control. So that fact and the character traits that got infused in me because of that environment, I can't be held responsible for any of that. The only thing that seems reasonable to hold me responsible for is how I react to the cards that I've been dealt both externally by the environment and internally in terms of the character traits that I have. So it's the things that I do in reaction to those given facts about me. The third feature that Campbell raises as part of the description of what's required for free will is more familiar. He says a person's action is the result of free will only if he could have done otherwise. I've already used this expression in these lectures, and the idea of could have done otherwise has occupied philosophers for a long time. But Campbell is clear that what he means by could have done otherwise is that if a person makes a truly free choice, then even if everything had been exactly the same up until the moment of choice, he could have chosen something else instead. So this goes back to the ideas of Alexander that you could choose the opposite. So when Campbell says a person could have done otherwise, that's what he means. So here now we have a summary of the descriptive answer that Campbell offers. He says, the notion of free will that we're interested in philosophy is the one that's connected to moral responsibility. In order to count as having that kind of free will, we look at three things. One is, does it apply to an internal act or an outward consequence? The only thing that could possibly be a free act is internal. You can't be held responsible for outward consequences, just the internal decision. Secondly, it applies to actions, only actions of which the agent is the sole cause. So the sphere of decision that we have when we make a decision is obviously constrained in lots of ways by things that we didn't choose. So our character traits, our upbringing, our genes, those things are not chosen by us. So Campbell says we need to focus more narrowly. When we say somebody makes a free choice, what we mean is that his agent self, produced the action, not the other influences. So the other influences were there, but when we say he made a free action, we mean he himself did it, not being compelled by those character traits. And finally, it will only count as free if it's an action that the agent didn't have to do, that the agent could have avoided, the agent could have done otherwise. So Campbell's view is, if an act meets those conditions, then it counts as free. Now again, this is just an account of what is required for free choice. It's only meant to answer the descriptive question, what's required for free will? Campbell goes on to address the substantive question. So now he asks, given this understanding of what free will requires, do we have it? Are we free? And Campbell argues that there is reason to think that we do have this kind of free will, that the answer to the substantive question is yes, we do. And he takes an interesting and sophisticated argumentative strategy that has two phases. He says, we have to approach this in pieces. The first question is, does one's moral experience, the way one experiences one's moral choices, does that cohere with the picture of free will that we have? So he thinks that this inner experience of our choices is especially important because he says, there's no better source of information about our moral decisions. This is something that libertarians in general have tended to appeal to. Their arguments often start from their experience of their own choice, that's where they begin. Now, the reason they begin there is because they think that's the best source of information about how we make choices, that asking somebody else how I make a choice is going to be less reliable than thinking about it myself, that I have better access to my decision-making processes than some other person. Now, Campbell recognizes that we do have to worry about whether we can trust our experience in various cases, that you can't just say, it seems this way to me, and so it probably is this way. He would recognize that in lots of cases, experience can deceive us. So just to take one example, phenomena like visual illusions can lead us to have experiences that bring us to have false beliefs. So in one famous illusion, you can have two lines that are measurably of the same length, but they can be made to look of different length just by putting little arrowheads on them in different directions. When you see these stimuli, your experience tells you, if you don't know already, it tells you that the lines are of different length. But the experience is mistaken, and you can quickly discover it by just getting out a ruler. Similarly for things like mirages. There we think we see water on the road, it seems like there's water on the road, but then when you get up to it, you see that your experience is misleading. There isn't anything like that. So Campbell recognizes that you can't just say, oh, it seems this way to me, therefore it has to be true. You can't always trust experience. And that gives rise to phase 2 of his argument. Phase 2 says, we need to decide, we need to assess whether we should be worried about whether the experience in this case can be trusted. So should we lose our confidence in our experience of freedom. In the visual illusion case, there's no question we can't trust our experience in those cases. Maybe it's different, though, in the case of free will. So now let's turn to the argument. In phase one, the aim is to characterize our experience of a moral decision. Campbell has already told us what is required for free will. The act must be internal, I must be the sole cause, and it must have been the case that I could have done otherwise. I could have decided something else. So what is our experience of our decisions like? Does it fit with these requirements? So first, do we experience our decisions as internal? Well, of course we do. This hardly requires an argument, and Campbell scarcely even mentions it in this part of his treatment. More interestingly, though, do we experience our choices as something that we could have done differently? And Campbell thinks that it's obvious that our experience suggests that the answer is yes. When we make a moral decision, he thinks, it seems to us like we could have done otherwise. And he says, I quote, "When we decide to exert moral effort to resist a temptation, we feel quite certain that we could withhold the effort." He makes an observation that will now ring a familiar tone in light of the previous libertarians. He says that if we didn't feel that we couldn't have done otherwise, if we didn't feel that we could have done otherwise, we wouldn't blame ourselves when we succumb to temptation. We wouldn't blame ourselves afterwards saying, oh, I could have resisted that temptation. He says the only reason I blame myself is because I think I could have resisted that temptation. Now, the third point, the sole cause. Do I experience myself as the sole cause of my action? And Campbell says that experience suggests that at least much of the time, I do seem to be the sole cause of my decisions. And critically, it seems like I sometimes successfully combat my strongest impulses. As a result, he says, my experience suggests that I am the sole cause of my decision. Because in that case, what my experience tells me is that I am something that stands apart from my character, that makes decisions solely without being dictated to by my character. My character, of course, shapes the options that are available to me, but then I get to decide whether or not to resist. So he thinks that the experience tells us that, yeah, you are able to oppose your character. You really, really want to do something. That's what your character is telling you, but then you stand back and say, no, I'm not going to do it. That is when you feel like you are the sole cause of your decision. So he thinks that the results of phase one are really positive. Introspectively, the moral decision appears to be one for which the agent could have done otherwise, and for which the agent is the sole cause. That's how it seems to me when I think about my own experience. Now we have to turn to phase two. Are there reasons to doubt our experience in the case of free will? Because the examples I used above for reasons to worry about the accuracy of our experience, they were all illusions about the external world. But usually when we have an experience about what's happening in our own minds, experience is a really good guide to what's happening. At a minimum, my experience is spectacular at telling me when I'm in pain. But more than that, in experimental conditions, people are very good at using introspection, looking inside their minds, to describe how they're solving a math problem, say, or a memory task. I'll talk about this a little bit more in lecture 15, but for now you can take my word for it that people are great at some of these kinds of introspective tasks. This provides a kind of prima facie bias in favor of thinking that experience is accurate about what happens in the mind. So Campbell would say, we'd need a very good reason to forego that general principle. We'd need a very good reason to say, well, when it comes to math and pain and all that stuff, then we're great at introspecting, but when it comes to free will, we're not. No, we can't do that. We need some reason to think that in this particular case, our introspection, our experience can't be trusted. And he says one reason that philosophers bring up is that we have good reasons to believe in determinism. So if you think back to the visual illusion example, why do we distrust our experience? Well, because we have good reason. We know that the two lines really are the same length, and so we have good reason to distrust our experience. Using the ruler tells us that our experience was wrong. So if we have an independent reason to think that determinism is true, then Campbell says that would be a reason to doubt that our experience of the free will case gets it right. So say the philosophers. But Campbell says that even if we do have a good reason to believe in determinism, he says, we also have a good reason from experience to believe that determinism is false. And so he argues that there's no reason in general to think that our general theoretical reasons about determinism are more important or better arguments than our own experience. Our own experience shouldn't be discounted just because we have these general highfalutin views about determinism. Reid, the other agent causationist that I've been talking about today, gives a more insistent response in this vein. He says that determinism is actually much less obvious than agent causation. He says we have an immediate experiential sense of agent causation. By contrast, whatever considerations are offered in favor of determinism, they're remote. And he says that we wouldn't even be able to formulate the doctrine of determinism if it weren't for the experience we have of causing our own decisions. Because he thinks that that's where the idea of causation comes from in the first place. According to Reid, the very notion of causation, the very notion that determinism relies on, is itself grounded in our experience of our free choices. So Reid says, it's likely that the idea of cause itself, quote, is derived from our own voluntary exertions in producing effects, and that if we weren't conscious of such exertions, we should have no conception at all of a cause. So according to Campbell, we have no general reason to give theoretical arguments about determinism priority over what our own experience tells us. Reid says the only reason we can even formulate determinism is because we have an experience of ourselves as agent causes. So our experience of our own causal power to make decisions, that's what forms the basis for causal judgments at all. And it's from that root concept, he says, that philosophers have built up the idea of determinism. So he thinks it would just be twisted logic to turn around and say we should give priority to determinism over experience. So the upshot of all this is that in lots of cases, we rightly take introspection to be reliable, and we need a really good reason to depart from this level of trust. But there is one further objection that's quite deep, and that's the question, is agent causation intelligible? That's the major objection to Campbell's theory, and he recognizes it, that this notion of agent causation seems really mysterious from a scientific point of view. Consider what the view says. It says, we can bundle together all of an individual's emotions and aspirations and dispositions and personality traits. Just consider all that the person's character. That character has a great deal of influence on an individual's decisions. Among other things, it sets the background range of choices. So just to take a really simple example, some options that would be considered by a person in one culture wouldn't even be contemplated by somebody with a different background. But there is, according to Campbell and Reid, there's another key factor, the self. That stands apart from all the other stuff, all the stuff that goes into the character. And the self can either go along with the character or resist the character. So, for instance, suppose that we outline everything about my character in relation to alcohol. And suppose that my personality traits and genetic predispositions all contribute to me loving alcohol. I have, let's suppose, strong emotional and historical attachments to alcohol, and I have a standing routine of having a drink every day at 5:30. Let's suppose everything about my character inclines me toward consuming alcohol at 5:30 p.m. Still, Campbell says, although my character is all pushing in the same direction, I, myself, can step back from the weight of my character and say, nope, not tonight. The self has the final word, and that's what grounds moral responsibility. Now, you might already be concerned about what this notion of self is supposed to correspond to. We could say with Reid that the self is the soul, but then we would want a more detailed account of what the soul is. But let's press on and ask, how does this self make the choice about whether to go along with character or resist it? One option is to say that the self weighs the different values, the values in favor of my going along with my character and the values against going along with my character. And then it decides accordingly on the basis of which value is stronger. That would give us an explanation for why the self chose one way rather than another, but it seems to slide back into determinism, because we've basically given a deterministic explanation for how the self works. It works by weighing various values and opting for the weightiest of reasons. Campbell recognizes this. He recognizes that this is a dead end and that a libertarian can't give a full explanation for how the self makes its decision. And he gives a blunt reply. He says, repeatedly, it is urged against the libertarian with a great air of triumph that, on his view, he can't say why I now decide to rise to duty. Of course he can't, Campbell says. If he could, he wouldn't be a libertarian. To account for a free act is a contradiction in terms. The request for an explanation is absurd, he says. So he thinks that you can't follow the path of saying, I'm going to explain why the self decides one way rather than another. But then what's the other alternative? Another alternative is you say, well, the self makes its decision randomly, that it just sort of flips a coin. But now that seems even worse than determinism. If it's just random, then it doesn't seem we even have control over the decision. So now we can state the general persistent philosophical problem that faces libertarianism. Typically, there are two ways that we can try to analyze a phenomenon. We can think of it deterministically as a function of all the causal inputs, or we can think of it as random. Science allows for both of these kinds of explanations. But what the libertarian needs, what Campbell needs, is something different. He needs something that is neither determined nor random. And that's the fundamental problem that arises, because neither of these things satisfies what Campbell wants. Campbell says there has to be a third way, something that doesn't fit into either determinism or randomness. And he says that's something else. That's the essence of free will. He labels this creative activity and says that in such cases, nothing determines the act save the agent's doing of it. To this, Campbell's opponents often say that this doesn't answer the question. He just restated the mystery. Campbell's defense here is to say that all you have to do is look inside, and you can see this kind of creative activity by reflecting on your own choices. But that remains extremely controversial.